So, New Haven. Better than the Pennsy, not as good as New York Central. Alright, you all know what time it is. But first, let's review the tiers. S tier, my favorites. A tier, really good, almost S tier. B tier, good. C tier, okay or not interesting enough. D tier, don't care. E tier, don't like. F tier, cursed. As you all should know, these are just my opinions. Feel free to disagree with me. Just respect my opinions and also respect others. We're here to have fun and chat about trains. We're not here to fight about them like idiots. Also, special thanks to my friend Nickel Floyd Railway Studios for coming on to help.
Heyo!
He'll be voicing some segments throughout the video. So, anyways, I hope you enjoy, and let's get to it. First up, we have the 060s. Typically, I put these engines in D tier because I'm not interested in switchers, but for once, I'm going to bump up this group of 060s. There were many flavors of 060 on the New Haven, but I'm going to focus exclusively on the T-Class. Built by ALCO in the early 1900s, the T-Class was the primary switcher of the New Haven, but as trains got heavier and the introduction of the Y-Class 080s, they were seen as unnecessary. Many were retired early on, with half of the fleet lasting through World War II. While their numbers further thinned out after the war, they lasted until nearly the end of steam. I actually like these little lads. I don't know, something about their top-mounted headlights and sloped tenders just really appeals to me. They're cool looking. Also worth noting, a few were rebuilt into saddle tanks and became the Van Nest shop switchers. Gotta pay my respects to some fine-looking saddle tanks. So yeah, for once I'm actually putting 060s in C tier. Good job, New Haven. Next up are the Y-Class 080s. I won't talk much about these as they're the typical Yorsaray 080 design, and yeah, I do like them, I just don't have much else to say about them. However, I want to mention the Y4s. These were 3-cylinder switchers and were pretty chunky. I like these not so much for their design, but how ridiculous they look as built with those giant tenders. They're just so goofy looking. We'll talk more about the 3-cylinder concept later, but I just wanted to give the Y4s a quick mention at least. Overall though, the Y-Class as a whole is cool, just not that interesting. C tier. Moving on, we have the 260s, the moguls. Usually I'm not drawn to moguls, but New England is like a drug for older locomotives and I just can't stop stimming. Like a lot of smaller engines on the New Haven, there were many different flavors of moguls, so I'm going to focus on the K1s. The K1s were built by both Baldwin and ALCO from the late 1890s to the early 1900s. Many were rebuilt over the years and went through various subclasses. They were referred to as heavy moguls, which might seem odd considering their wheel arrangement, but they were indeed heavier compared to the earlier K2 through K5 class. The K1s were the backbone of New Haven's many branch lines, with many surviving until nearly the end of steam. I enjoy the moguls. Their long service life, despite being so primitive in a sea of bigger and stronger engines, even running alongside diesels for a short period, really interests me. They even got both footboards and the really fresh looking steel-plated plows. While not my favorite steam engines on New Haven, the moguls are fascinating little creatures nonetheless. B tier. Next are the 280s, the Connies. I'll be honest, I'm actually not super interested in the New Haven's Connies, and it's mainly because, frankly, they didn't have many. Most railroads went ham in the early years with consolidations, I'm looking at you, Pennsy, yet the New Haven didn't. They were a fast freight road, so the larger drivered moguls proved more effective. Real strange, honestly. They had a few variations, but since many of them were retired early, I'll be focusing on the F5s. Built by ALCO in 1912, these were not directly for the New Haven, but the Central New England, a subsidiary of the New Haven. The C&E was fully integrated in 1927, thus gaining their New Haven numbers 150 to 164. A total of 15 were built and used on the famous Maybrook line that crossed the infamous Poughkeepsie Bridge. They certainly put their nearly 45,000 pounds of tractive effort to use. Once newer locomotives came on the roster, they were transferred elsewhere on the system, doing pretty much any job until nearly the end of steam. As far as Connies go, they're alright, but I think these serve more as an interesting look into New Haven's motive power choices rather than interesting locomotives on their own. Still though, not bad engines by any means. C tier. Now here's an interesting one, the 440s, the American types. Usually I don't care for American types, they're just not my cup of tea, but New Havens? Oh boy, these are quite cool. I'm not going to mention the earlier American types because, let's face it, 99% of railroads back then used some form of 440 and plenty of them. So for both of our sakes, we're going to stick with the A-class. They're the most interesting to me. I'll let my friend give a bit of history.
The A1s and A3s were built during the turn of the century and were incredibly modern compared to the typical American type of the time. The A1s had 73-inch drivers, and the A3s had 78-inch drivers when they were first built, later being upgraded to 79-inch. These modern Americans were used on the shoreline's top trains in their early days, but as time went on, they got bumped down to various types of jobs. While New Haven didn't scrap them right away, they kept them and rebuilt some with newer valve gear, new pistons, pretty much an entire new overhaul. But unfortunately, most of them didn't last through the 1930s. Luckily, a few did make it nearly to the end of steam, specifically the A1s. They were found on smaller jobs, and most notably the wire train, basically a work train for the electrified division.
Yeah, these American types actually surprised me. I knew about them, sure, but it wasn't until I really delved into their history that I grew fond of them. I always love seeing the antique locomotives be modernized into something a lot more robust and efficient. The A1s and A3s are certainly another case of the New England mindset. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. A tier. Coming up next are the 460s, the 10-wheelers. I'll be honest, I don't have much to say about these, they're just solid engines. And frankly, that's totally fine. Sometimes you don't need to be the best to be likable. The G4s were the most well-known of the 10-wheelers. Early 1900s Baldwin built, modernized over time, looked good and nearly lasted until the end of steam doing various jobs. Not much else to say from me, but I'll let my friend tell some interesting tales regarding the G4s.
Engineer Sam Collins of Mattapan, Massachusetts, quote-unquote owned G4A number 836, running express trains from Boston to Woods Hole. He even got permission from New Haven higher-ups to be assigned to the last commuter train out of Boston on the Mattapan line, parking the engine at the small terminal where he walked a half-mile down the street to his own home. Sam took such care of the 836, and it was the final G4 to be retired in 1948. His tender love and care propelled it those few extra miles. The next story involves two G4s, 820 and 846. Those two were sent over to Australia in 1944 and renumbered 79 and 78 respectively for the Commonwealth Railway. Despite being nicknamed kangaroos for their apparent bounciness, they were highly praised for their lovely sounding whistles. Most likely Baldwin 5 chimes. 78 was retired and scrapped fairly early on, while 79 lasted all the way into 1950.
Pretty fascinating stuff. While not my favorite 10-wheelers, they still made their mark on New Haven and looked fairly decent doing so. B tier. Moving on, we have the 442s, the Atlantics. These engines just aren't that interesting to me. Really good for their time, but pretty quickly eclipsed by the Pacifics. That being said though, like the 10-wheelers, they still found good use on commuter trains. Most notably, an Atlantic and two American Flyer coaches were backup for the Comet trains from Boston to Providence. They were speed demons, but they also tended to ride rough at higher speeds, so certainly not the most comfortable engines, but by no means useless. Again though, they don't really interest me. They just kind of existed and were pretty quickly retired after World War II, so they're going into C tier. Speaking of the Pacifics, here's the I-Class. These engines are loved by a lot of New Haven Steam fans, including myself. I honestly don't have a favorite, so I'm going to rank all of them together. The earlier Pacifics were a mix of ALCO and Baldwin builds and actually look really good. They remind me a lot of the NYC's K3s. The one thing I don't like about their earlier Pacifics is their small tenders. They just look so short and stumpy. Otherwise though, solid engines. A lot of the earlier Pacifics would later be pushed down into commuter service and intermingling with the Atlantics and the 10-wheelers, but in the early years, they were the backbone of heavy passenger trains and even fast freights. Now, the Pacific every New Haven fan knows about, the I4s. I'm split, frankly. On one hand, I love them, but on the other, I can't deny they look very cluttered on top. For some reason, New Haven mounted their air tanks to the top of the boiler and put this really cheap looking smoke deflector behind the stack. It's very Frisco 1522-esque and honestly doesn't look that good. Yet for some reason, I love these engines. It might have to do with the top mounted Alescos or the white walling or my love of utilitarian-esque engines, but for whatever reason, these Pacifics are so cool. Very Southern PS4 looking. Also, it's worth noting that the I4s had a variety of different tenders, from stumpy ones to Vanderbilts. The I4s had a wide variety of appearances. Something cool to note as well is the official final run of Steam on the New Haven were two I4s, number 1372 and 1388, with 1388 nearly being sent off for scrap, yet being repaired and put to work for this last hurrah. I'd have to say the I4s might be my favorite, but it's hard to say. The Pacifics as a whole were some great engines. They're very close to being S tier, but A tier is a good spot for them. There's one more I-Class though, although it is no Pacific, and it is arguably one of the most beautiful engines ever built for American railroading. The I5s. We all know where this one is going. Like, come on, it's obvious, isn't it? These are some of the most beautiful steam engines I've ever seen. Hell, I'd argue the I5s rival the New York Central's Empire Hudsons. That's a tall feat to match in my opinion. But first, my friend's gonna talk some history before we break the I5s down some more.
By the mid-1930s, the I-4 Pacifics were straining themselves to keep up with the heavier Boston to New Haven trains, so newer, more powerful engines were needed. After some testing, it was decided these new engines would be the famed 464 Hudson design, which found great success on the New York Central and Milwaukee roads, to name a few. Interestingly, these engines were meant to be built by ALCO, but due to budgetary constraints, remember what time period this was, Baldwin won the contract. It was also decided to streamline the I5s, being done by Otto Kohler, famed industrial designer for American railroads, and an amazing choice for the New Haven's new engine. And so, in 1937, Baldwin erected all 10 of New Haven's final steamers. Unfortunately, they weren't without their faults. It was discovered early on that the I5s tended to kink the rails at higher speeds above 81 miles an hour. These issues were soon solved, but the I5s never topped 70 miles afterwards. A smaller issue was the minor cracks in the rear driver pedestal. Their injectors not supplying enough water, or the nose cones tended to overheat and they would melt the wires to the headlight. All of these issues were found fairly early on and quickly rectified. The I5s quickly became the face of the New Haven, but dieselization was on the horizon, and the introduction of DL109s brought the end of various steam engines across the system. Yet the I5s remained in mainline service, having better pulling power and reliability than ALCO's newer DL109. The I5s finally finished out their careers in 1950, with the number 1407, the last I5 in active service, running a northbound train to Boston. Her fire was dropped, and it was the final hurrah for New Haven's streamlined steamers.
These engines, to put it simply, are just beautiful. Their streamlining is so graciously done, the black with the white striping, and their drivers especially look very unique. Most streamlined engines are more focused on looks rather than maintenance, but that's not the case with the i5s. They strike that balance of looking good while also being maintenance friendly. They're not afraid to be locomotives, if you get what I mean. And my favorite thing about the i5s, the whistles are just... God, I love Hancock whistles. I love the i5s. Although, interestingly, they're not my absolute favorite New Haven steam engine. But don't worry though, the i5s are well deserving of S tier. Truly, some of Baldwin's finest in my opinion. Next up we have the 2A2s, the Mikados. There were two types of Mikados, the J1s and the J2s. My friend's going to talk about the J1s while I talk about the J2s.
The J1s were light Mikados built by ALCO in 1916 and numbered 3000 to 3024. Interesting to note about them was their lower heights. Some areas required lower riding engines to clear bridges, so the J1s were built with lower boilers in mind, giving them somewhat of a stumpy appearance. It's also worth noting, 3023 and 3024 were built with water tube fireboxes, or the McClellan boiler. We'll touch on those more in a bit, but they didn't really work out. Oddly though, they weren't replaced until World War II, and 3023 and 3024 just kinda sat around the Reedville shops until then. As time went on, better engines came in for hauling freight, and they bumped the J1s down to lighter duties and local freights. That being said though, they were still a capable engine. One famous example of the J1s in local service was the old Valley Division, the now modern-day Valley Railroad out in Essex, Connecticut. The 1950s brought the end of the J1s, however 3 survived in snow-melting service, being 3006, 3020, and the most famous, 3016. 3016 is the most famous of the J1s, as it had the most turbulent ending on the New Haven. In 1953, 3016 ran one final fan trip on the shoreline, a year after the I4s pulled the official farewell to steam. Then, after a few years of snow-melting service, a call came to New Haven from Columbia Pictures asking about the shooting for their new movie known as It Happened to Jane. 3016 was chosen, refitted back into a regular steam engine, renumbered and relettered as Eastern and Portland Railroad number 97. She was fired up for the filming. Truly a swan song for a group of 25 stumpy freight Mikados, outlasting every other New Haven steam engine.
Next are the J2s. These were heavy mics and only numbered 3100 to 3107 and built the same year as the J1s, also by ALCO. They weren't very successful though. Frankly, they were a fireman's worst nightmare. Imagine this. You're a fireman who's been assigned to a road freight in the early 1920s and you see a J2 powering the train. Your first thought shouldn't be, oh dear God, I gotta hand fire this thing? Yep. The J2s never got stokers. They were hand-fired fat boys. After the 1920s, the New Haven permanently assigned them to heavy yard duty and pusher service, where they found more use. Still, they never received stokers. I can't imagine the pain train crews experienced when they had to deal with these things. Unsurprisingly, they were the first modern New Haven steam engines to go, being retired in 1946. The Mikados are honestly a fascinating bunch of engines, two wildly different types that had wildly different outcomes. Yet despite their differences, I still like them both. Sure, the J1s were kinda stumpy and didn't do that much in the later years, and the J2s were too fat to really be effective, but they both look good, and 3016's story is especially interesting. They're not quite 8 tier, but there's no shame in being a B tier. Damn fine engines. Here's my actual favorite New Haven steam engines, the R1 Mountains. For new viewers, this may be a surprise, but for some who have seen the previous tier lists, this is no shock. I adore mountain types, and I especially love the mountains New Haven had. The R1s at least. We'll talk about the other R classes later. The R1s first popped onto the scene in 1919. The original 10 numbered 3300 to 3309 were USRA spec and built by ALCO, specifically their Richmond works. Several more R1s followed in the later years between 1920 and 1924, also ALCO builds, though at their primary plant in Schenectady this time. Something to note, the Richmond built ones were Baker valve gear, while the Schenectady built ones were Southern valve gear, although some Schenectady built R1s got Baker valve gear later in their life. The R1s were the primary engines for fast freight on the New Haven, used on pretty much every major division. That's not to say they didn't haul passengers. In fact, they saw some success in passenger service too, but freight was truly their bread and butter. Originally, the R1s had small 4-axle tenders, but once those Y4s came in with their giant tenders, they were quickly swapped and gave some of the R1s a much needed boost. After World War II though, their numbers started to drop, with the final 4 being condemned in November of 1951. Funnily enough, the last R1s were the last 482s on the roster, outlasting the newer and more powerful R2s and 3s. And also of note, 4 R1s were held for possible sale to another railroad, although sadly this ended up never happening. I stand by my statement of these being my favorite steam engines on the entire New Haven system. They were speedy, decent pullers, and efficient, and man did they also look the part. I love Alesco feed water heaters as I think they add a utilitarian look to steam engines. Placement is everything though when it comes to appliances, and the R1s got theirs absolutely right. Most R1s also had their air compressors moved to the pilot, and if you know me, that's an automatic eye catcher too. And one final piece of the lovely pie, the new tenders some of the R1s got. I think the standard 6-axle box tenders some R1s got were much cleaner looking, but I'm also a sucker for Vanderbilt tenders, and those further add to the utilitarian appearance of the R1s. Not many engines can rival the love I have for the New York Central L2As, but the New Haven's R1s certainly challenge the L2A spot. Definitely some of the nicest looking mountains ever made. I love these engines. S tier. Next up we have the other mountains, the R2s and the R3s. These are by no means bad engines. I think they're good actually, but not good enough to be high on the list. Here, let me explain. The R2s were built by ALCO between 1924 and 1926 and numbered 3500 to 3507. Only 8 were ever built. But something seems familiar. Yeah, they're almost identical to a New York Central L2A. Now that alone must make them my favorites, right? No, actually. To me, it just looks like a diet L2A. Now they're not bad looking, but as much as I love the New Haven's goofy looking headlights, this is where I think they don't work. It looks like the R2s just have this schnoz that makes them look like they're snorting or something. But otherwise, they're not bad, just kind of boring to me. Now, I've mentioned them before, but this is where the McClellan boilers need to be discussed. These boilers were known as water tube fireboxes. It was a different system compared to a conventional boiler and crown sheet firebox. I'm not an expert in this stuff, but the basic gist of them was to, in theory, provide better water circulation, and to prevent stable failures by wrapping the firebox in these tubes and essentially dishing the crown sheet. I believe. I don't know, but they didn't work very well apparently. The reason I bring these up is because New Haven seemed really hell-bent on keeping these McClellan boilers in service. For some reason. Especially on their R2s and R3s. Speaking of R3s, let's talk about those next. The R3s are actually quite interesting because they were actually 3-cylinder mountains. 3-cylinder engines are often just experiments tried by railroads and then either rebuilt or scrapped. Some railroads found success with 3-cylinder engines, most notably Union Pacific and Southern Pacific, but apparently so did New Haven. Success, though, is a strong word, and the truth of the matter is, a 3-cylinder engine in American applications would work well if a railroad's budget would allow it. The R3s were by no means perfect. As mentioned earlier, they had McClellan boilers even when it was proven not to work. They also were a pain to fire, their stokers were an inferior design and had trouble keeping the fire well lit, thus resulting in poor steaming. And obviously, the 3-cylinder design caused maintenance costs to rise exponentially. These R3s sound like failures, right? Well, surprisingly, they kinda worked. The R3s had incredible pulling power and even some speed behind them. Plus, a lot of their issues were later fixed and made them somewhat better. Performance-wise, they were pretty good. As for looks, they're certainly unique. We'll go with that. Overall though, the R2s and 3s are still good engines, just either mid-looking or flat out too cluttered to look appealing. B tier. Finally, we have the large lads, the 210-2s. If there was an engine to describe the famous Maybrook line, it'd be these beasts. The L1s were the most powerful engines the New Haven ever owned, with nearly 78,000 pounds of tractive effort. These things could pull. They were seen as problematic in the early years due to their dislike of higher speeds, but they more than made up for it in pulling power, so they were transferred exclusively to Maybrook line trains, although branching out more in later years. I can't imagine going 12 miles per hour with a heavy train over the Poughkeepsie Bridge. Their biggest problem though, crazy enough, was there's just too many of them. 50 were built, and most were seen as surplus due to lack of traffic, so many of them were stored and cannibalized for parts. Interestingly, some are used as hump engines for Maybrook Yard, thus gaining footboards. World War II brought many steam engines out of storage and rebuilt to more modern standards, including the L1s, now working hard once again to move heavy trains to and from New England. By the end of World War II, many were retired and scrapped, but a few clung on till almost the end of steam. A fine display of power from the L1s. I like these engines, but in my opinion, the biggest thing holding them back from S tier is the rear trailing bogie. I'm sorry, but what the hell is that thing? It looks so dinky and just gross. I don't know, that rear wheel just murders the L1 for me. It's so bad looking.
This is cancer.
Other than that though, they look really good. Again, my bias for front-mounted Alescos and air pumps will always give engines like the L1 some points. But I also like big lumbering heavy haulers, so there's more points to the L1s also. The beasts of the New Haven are going into A tier. Before we fully conclude, I'm also going to throw up the Fornies and Bogies, cause I'm almost certain someone's going to mention them. I don't really care about vintage steam like pre-1900s, so honestly I don't have much to say. There were commuter engines along the Harlem River, but aside from that, they barely lasted past the 1900s. D tier. Alright, that about wraps everything up. Thank you all so much for watching, and a special thanks to Nickel Floyd. Alright, should we rip the band-aid off?
Yeah, you really can't hide it any longer.
Alright then. If you haven't noticed, I've been rather vague about retirement and scrapping of engines. And there's a reason for that. There is not a single New Haven steam engine left. Every one of them has been scrapped. I usually do a cursed engine as a joke to end off on, but not this time. Instead, I want to highlight two engines, the 2339 and the 3016. Pictured here is the 2339 at the Van Ness shops in 1953. At this time, it was the only active steam engine on the entire railroad. It was then scrapped a few months later. While it officially wasn't the last, this hit so hard for me. A small little switcher in a sea of change, toiling away at some repair shop only to be destroyed just a few months later. One has to wonder, if the engine was alive, what would it be thinking in that moment? And then we have the 3016. Surely this engine was saved, right? It was used on fan trips. It was a movie star. Surely someone wanted the 3016. I'll let this excerpt from New Haven Power by J.W. Swanberg say it all.
Robert S. McKernan of the New Haven's Public Relations Department states the effort to donate the 3016 to Essex or New Haven, Connecticut, as well as the Danbury Fair, were all turned down. But after the engines were already gone, word came from Danbury that the fair did want the 3016. A fast call was made to Loria Brothers, with the very sad response: the torches are already cutting.
And just like that, 3016 was gone. Every New Haven steam engine was gone. No 3016, no 2339, no I5s, not even Sam Collins' engine, the 836, was spared. Nothing. Everything was reduced to piles of scrap metal. Goodbye, dear friends. But there is technically one. Number 3025 of the Valley Railroad, a Chinese-built Mikado dressed to resemble a J1. Some people scoff at the 3025, and I get why. It's neither pure New Haven or American, but if you ask me, it carries on the legacy of New Haven steam. The memories of New Haven steam will live on through not only the 3025, but photography, videos, models, virtual representations, and more. My goal with these tier lists is not only to share my thoughts on trains, but to keep the history and memories of these railroads alive, whether they're good, bad, or middle of the road. So go out there and enjoy your favorite railroad. Run your model trains. Read up some more on history. Create them in a simulator. Or crack open your DVDs and relive the glory days of American railroading at its finest hour. And if you're like me, maybe somewhere out there, in an alternate timeline, a New Haven survivor persists. It could be the 3016, it could be Sam's 10-wheeler, the 836, maybe even an I5. One thing's for sure though, no matter when or where, the New York, New Haven, and Hartford will always be a great railroad at work.